Good morning. So we are back on the record in the trial involving Stephen Bourgoin. My understanding is we are having some technical issues in the overflow courtroom, but I think we have seats available in this courtroom, so I don't want to delay the trial. We'll get started. RAS has been contacted in the event that's it, but I think we're all set. Do attorneys have anything before we begin?
I don't.
No.
Judge.
Okay, then bring the jury. All right, please. So I wanted to say good morning to the jurors, and we will start by just asking if, since yesterday when we ended the day, if you've learned anything new about the case or become aware of any information of which you were not aware at the time of the jury draw, or which you now recall, which might influence you about the case, or if there's any reason that's come up as to indicate that you cannot be fair and impartial in delivering a verdict in this case.
No.
Okay. Counsel satisfied?
Yes, thank you, Judge.
Okay. The state can proceed then.
Thank you. The state would call Lorraine Shannon Wells.
Solemnly affirm the evidence you shall give relative to the cause now under consideration shall be the whole truth and nothing but the truth under James and penalties of perjury. Please be seated. You're going to pull your chair forward and speak into the microphone, please.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Please make sure to keep your voice up. You have a very soft voice, okay? Please tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury your name.
It's Laureen Wells. My last name was Shannon in 2016.
Okay. And you married Jim Wells?
Yes, I did.
And which town or city do you reside in?
Calais. We're right on the line of East Montpelier and Calais.
Okay. And are you employed?
I am for the state of Vermont Department of Corrections.
Okay. Are you a probation officer?
I am.
Okay. So I'd like to take you back to October 8th, 2016. Were you traveling 89 at that late that night?
Yes, we were.
And who was with you?
My husband, Jim.
And who was driving?
Jim was driving.
So could you please tell us what you saw when you were driving on 89 that night?
When we were in Williston, the Williston cruiser went by us. He was going pretty fast with his blue lights on. And shortly after he passed us, we had caught up to him because he had stopped. And there was a man in the road flagging people down. So we pulled into the shoulder, and so the cruiser was there. And then there was a truck that had crashed, and the engine was steaming, and that was in the passing lane. So we pulled up almost directly across from the truck. And then once we got up there, we saw the cruiser leaving, and we both had said out loud, like, I wonder where he's going, because it was obvious there was a crash there. And so he was gone. And then
Well, let me stop you a moment. At that point, are you both still in the car?
yes, we are.
Okay. All right. And then what happened next?
And so there was a couple of people standing on the interstate. No traffic was coming through. And I said to Jim, I said, are you going to get out to help? And as I was saying it, he was already out of the car. I knew he had first aid experience, and he's a police officer, so that's why he was getting out. He told me to stay in the car. He got out, and shortly after that, was one woman who kept screaming, and so
Did you see where that was coming from?
it was right from behind me, the folks behind me. And I was still in the passenger seat. And then I jumped over to the driver's seat to see if I could see more of what was going down on the bank. And I couldn't see, but when I turned to my left shoulder, when I turned around, I could see all the emergency vehicles back there with all their lights. And I was confused as to why they were not coming up. And I remember yelling, just saying, hurry up and get here. But nobody was coming through. And I was starting to get really worried about Jim. And the woman kept screaming, and she kept saying that we need to do something to help. So I got out of the car, and I was hesitant, and I crossed the interstate.
Do you need a moment, Ms. Wells?
Just one moment. When I crossed the interstate, I could see a car completely on fire. I could see Jim and some other people next to the car, and they were dragging a body. They were dragging a girl, and my own thoughts were that she can't be alive, but I didn't know that for certain. And then I could hear somebody, I think it was the Williston officer, yelling, we got to get back. We can't save the rest. We have to get back. I thought I heard somebody say it was going to blow. And when he said that, I looked, and I'm next to the defendant's truck. And it was smoking, so when I heard that, I'm thinking, oh no, the car's going to blow, the truck's going to blow. And I heard him yell, get out of the road, all of you.
Excuse me, heard who yell?
I think it was the Williston officer.
Okay.
It was a police officer down there yelling, saying, get out of the road. But at that point in time, I did not know that there was a cruiser that was stolen and gone. I thought that was an officer at that time earlier that had left. So when he was yelling that, I just remember yelling, I'm not going without Jimmy. I just didn't want to go without my husband. But I turned and I ran straight across the interstate to where my car was. And I jumped into the driver's seat. I briefly thought, I got to get out of here. I got to drive to Richmond. I just got to get out of here. But then I didn't want to leave Jim. And shortly after that, I could see this like light, and this loud explosion, it hit the truck that was near me. And when it hit the truck, it was extremely loud that I screamed. And when it hit the truck, my window was down, and the white car, I didn't know it was a cruiser at the time, came flying by me. It felt very close to me. I could feel the wind of the cruiser blowing at me. I could feel pieces of things coming in my car, which later was glass. I could hear some little things hitting my car, and I felt something on the roof, hit the roof.
What did you do next?
At that point in time, I just didn't know what was going on. I thought cars were blowing up for some reason, and I had no idea why cars were blowing up. So I thought my car was going to blow up. I was right next to the truck. I had to get out of the car. So I got out, and I ran into the woods. And when I was running, it all just seemed like a fog to me. I kept screaming, and my mom had died October 9th of 2015, so it was almost her anniversary. And I remember screaming, saying things I can't believe I just died. I just died, and I don't want to be dead. And as I'm running, I remember crying to my mom. And I was saying, I'm not ready to be with you yet. I go, it's not time yet. And I grabbed onto a tree, and I was holding onto the tree in the dark woods. And I just really thought I was dead for a little bit. And
Did your husband come find you at some point?
well, yeah, at that point, just before he came, I kind of snapped out of it, and I figured it doesn't matter if it's October 8th or if it's October 9th. I'm not dead. I realized that I wasn't dead. And I was screaming, and I saw Jim run up into the woods. He heard me screaming, and he didn't stay long. He grabbed me quick, and he said, they're dead. And he said, all 4 of them are dead. He goes, I saw a junior operator's license. They're all dead. I need you to stay here. I go, here in the woods? And I went, I'm scared. And he goes, then run up further in the woods. I gotta go. And he was gone. He was just there and gone.
And at some point, did you come back down out of the woods?
After a long time of standing there, holding on the tree and crying, I went down quickly once. I didn't look. I just wanted to get my coat. I was getting cold. And then I went back up. And then I heard some more noises and more people screaming. And I could see people running and screaming and ducking in front of my car. They were hiding from whatever was exploding in the cruiser. And so I continued to stay up there for quite some time. And then when I came down from the woods, Jim was near my car. And when we were getting ready to leave, I looked at him and I said, just wait a minute. This was the first time I had looked, and I looked down the street and I just said, oh my God, this looks like a war zone. And I said, we got out of here, and we went up to Central Vermont Hospital.
Were you able to drive your car from the...
It was drivable, yes.
Okay. All right. We'll talk with your husband next, so he'll give us more information about that. Thank you. That's all the questions I have.
Any crossing?
No questions. Thank
Okay,
you.
step down, thank you.
Solemnly affirm that the evidence you shall give relative to the cause and all under consideration shall be the truth and nothing but the truth, and innocent of perjury. I do. Please be seated. Pull your chair up, speak into the microphone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Please state your name.
My name is James Wells, W-E-L-L-S.
Okay. And you are married to Maureen Shannon Wells, who we just met here previously?
I am.
Okay. And where do you live?
I live in Adamat, which is a subsidiary of Calais.
And are you employed?
I am.
How are you employed?
I'm employed as a senior deputy sheriff with the Washington County Sheriff's Department.
And were you employed with the Washington County Sheriff's Department back in October 2016?
I was.
So your wife has told us about you traveling I-89, going home, and coming upon a scene. So we won't go over that again.
Correct.
But at some point you get out of the car, is that correct? And tell her to stay in the car?
I did.
Okay, and so when you got out of the car, where did you go?
When I got out of the car, I went down into the median of between 89,
And what was
between
in the
the
median?
southbound and northbound lane.
What was in the median?
There was a Volkswagen Jetta.
And what was happening with the Volkswagen Jetta that caused you to go down there?
There was a Williston officer down there, and the car was on fire.
Okay. And so when you got, were you able to get all the way down into the median?
I was.
And when you got there, what did you do?
The Williston officer was down there, and the front of the vehicle was on fire. And there were two other people. There was a male and a female there. And the Williston officer was trying to get people out of the vehicle.
Okay. Was he able to do that?
No. The Williston officer was at the rear passenger side, driver's rear passenger, trying to open the door at that point, because that part wasn't on fire at that point. It was more toward the front of the vehicle. And I was behind him, and the other two people were with us. And he was verbally telling them, open the door, unlock the door. It was either jammed shut or locked. He tried to open it, but it was too hot.
Okay. So what did you do next?
Well, that was very brief. The fire just really engulfed at that point, to the point where I thought it was getting really unsafe. There was a person outside the vehicle that was, I believe at that point, was an occupant at some point. And I felt that that person we should move that person away from the vehicle in case, we didn't know at that point if they were still alive or not.
Was it a male or a female?
It was a female.
Okay.
So we ended up moving her back even further down the median, away from the burning car.
Okay. And did you attend to the female that was on the ground, or were the other people attending her?
I did briefly. Like I said, there was a male and a female down there. They identified themselves as medical personnel. Once we brought the female down further, the female advised that she felt a pulse. It was weak, but she had a pulse.
Did you subsequently learn that that female had died?
I did later on, yes.
So what did you do next?
That's when it became really chaotic. She no sooner got those words out of her mouth that she had a pulse, but I heard an officer up on the roadway on 89. I heard him yelling, get out of the road, get out of the road. And I believed get out of the road, get out of the road, he's coming back, is what I heard.
And did you go up the embankment back to the interstate?
Not at that point.
And what did you do?
Well, no sooner he got that out of his mouth, because there was a large group of people up on the passing lane of the interstate observing what was going on. And he made that statement, and I heard a vehicle approaching at an extremely high rate of speed.
Okay. And did you see that vehicle that you heard?
I did.
And can you describe what the vehicle was?
It was a Williston police cruiser.
And so what did you next see?
I saw an impact. I mean, it was so quick. There was an impact, and there was just an explosion of debris, dust, vehicle parts all over, and just a flash of light, just a huge explosion.
At that point, prior to you seeing the cruiser coming back, did you know that the cruiser had actually left the scene?
I did.
And how did you know that?
When we pulled up on the scene, I'd actually let the Williston officer by. We were on 89 coming from the drive-ins. We were headed southbound. Just beyond the rest area, I saw blue lights. I allowed the cruiser to go by and came up on this scene. So I actually parked in the breakdown lane of 89 on the travel portion of the breakdown lane of 89. And the cruiser was just ahead of us, and we parked next to a Toyota pickup that was clear was in a motor vehicle crash.
But did you, after you got out of your car and went down to the median, were you aware of whether that cruiser left the scene before it actually came back onto the scene?
Yes.
Okay, and
Yeah.
how were you made aware of it?
When I pulled up to the median, I observed the cruiser drive off just briefly. I observed the Williston officer come up, grab a fire extinguisher, go back to the vehicle. Excuse me. And when the Williston officer was headed back to the vehicle with the fire extinguisher, I saw the vehicle drive off, and I thought it was odd. I said, where's he going? And then I said, oh, wait a minute, he's moving so fire personnel could get in and put the fire out of the car.
So you didn't see who actually had gotten into the cruiser?
I did not.
Okay. So you hear the crash and the impact and an explosion. What do you do next?
Panic.
Okay. And did you move anywhere, go anywhere?
I did.
Okay. Where did you go?
I went back up to the interstate because I thought a dozen people were dead.
And you went back up to the interstate, and what did you do when you got there?
I heard chaos. I heard people screaming, smoke, debris, vehicles everywhere. Everybody was screaming. I heard somebody screaming in the woods. Just terrible, out of control screaming in the woods.
Were you looking for your wife at that
I
point?
was.
Okay, and you found her?
Yes, she was alive.
Okay. So after you found your wife, what is the next thing that you did?
I found my wife approximately 20 yards into the woods behind a large tree, terrified, screaming, crying. I took a minute to tell her. She thought she was dead. She says, I'm dead. I said, you're alive. Relax. Stay behind the tree. I'll come back and get you when it's safe.
So where did you go from there?
I went back I approached a sergeant from Williston Police, identified myself, and
Do you know which sergeant that was?
I don't. I just know he was a sergeant.
Okay, all right, and you identified yourself and did what?
I said, is there anything I can do, or do you need me? And he threw me a traffic vest and said, just start picking up pieces. Start out doing whatever we could.
Okay, and so did you do that?
I did.
So tell us, what do you mean picking up pieces?
Trying to sort out the chaos. Like I said, there were people screaming. There was vehicles. The Williston cruiser ended up being on fire. Ammunition was going off from the fire.
What kind of sound was that making with the ammunition going on?
It was gunshots. It was, when you hear somebody fire a gun, there was gunshots. There was spare ammunition, it sounds like, in the back of the cruiser, which is kind of standard for what we do.
Okay. And so you were picking up debris from the roadway? Is that what you were doing?
No, I went to start assisting people because, like I said, I didn't know who was injured. I didn't know if we had people that were expired or not from the impact. So I eventually made it further down past the Williston police cruiser to assist another trooper.
Do you know who that trooper was?
It was Trooper Brad Miller.
Okay. And you said you went to assist him. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
I observed Trooper Miller down on the shoulder of the passing lane, which would have been north of where the two vehicles were, the Williston Cruiser and the Toyota pickup. And familiar with Trooper Miller, so I approached, and there was a gentleman on the ground, and there was another gentleman at the gentleman's head, and Trooper Miller was on his left side, northbound.
And what happened next?
The gentleman was trying to get up off the ground, and he was telling him to stay. The medical personnel was, stay, don't move. and he kept trying to get up off the ground, get up off the ground.
Let me ask you this, were his handcuffs on or off at that point, do you know?
I don't recall at that point.
And when you say he was trying to get up off the ground, what do you mean?
He's lifting his torso up from the pavement.
And were you asked to do anything with respect to that?
Trooper Miller asked me to help restrain him.
So the two of you restrained him then at that point?
Correct. I restrained the gentleman on his right side. Trooper Miller restrained him on his left side.
Okay. And you were able to get it back under control?
Yes.
Okay. Did you do anything else with respect to the crash scene that night?
Shortly after holding the gentleman down, more people arrived, and that's when I left there, and I went to help if we needed to get traffic moving or fire apparatus in. At that point, fire was already on scene and trying to deal with things. I actually went back down to the motor vehicle, and there was a fireman there, and I was helping him, pull hose or whatever where he needed it to extinguish the flames.
Did you return to your car at some point?
I did.
And was there damage to your car as a result
Yes,
of this?
there was pretty significant damage to my car.
Can you tell the ladies and gentlemen what kind of damage it was?
The hood was scratched up. There was dents all over it. The front bumper had gouges in it. The driver's side front fender was all scratched up, and the passenger compartment of my vehicle was completely filled with broken glass all over the dash, the seats, console.
Did you receive any injuries as a result of what happened there on the scene?
I was treated for smoke inhalation at Central Vermont Medical Center.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have. Defense may have some.
No question. Okay, you can step down. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Could you state your name and spell your last name, please?
Amy Nolan, Nolan.
Thank you. And how are you employed?
I am a detective sergeant with the Vermont State Police.
And how long have you been employed by the Vermont State Police?
Since January 2005.
And what is your current rank?
Detective sergeant.
I'm sorry, you said that. Were you employed by them on October 8th of 2016?
I was.
Were you a detective sergeant at that point as well?
Yes, I was.
Okay. And were you assigned to a specific team or specialty at the time?
I was a member of the crime scene search team.
Okay. And on October 8th of 2016, were you tasked with any assignments as it relates to the case against Stephen Bourgoin?
On October 9th, I became involved in the case. I assisted with some interviews of various witnesses, and then, excuse me, at the end of the day on October 9th, the crime scene search team was activated to conduct a search on Mr. Bourgoin's vehicle.
And where did you do that search?
At the Williston State Police Barracks.
Okay. And what was the specific vehicle that you were tasked with searching?
It was a Toyota Tacoma truck, I believe.
And is that a typical task that you would do as part of the crime scene search team?
Yes.
Was the Tacoma that you processed in a locked, kind of secure place at the barracks?
Yes, it was in one of the garage bays within the barracks.
Okay. And were you working, as you were processing this truck, were you working within certain parameters that were outlined by a search warrant?
Yes, we were conducting the search based on a search warrant.
Okay. So can you give just sort of a quick overview as to what you did to process the Tacoma?
Certainly. That day, I took photographs of the vehicle. I assisted, excuse me, with evidence collection of various items within the vehicle. We documented seat positions, etc.
And in fact, were photographs of the Tacoma taken?
They were.
Okay. I'm going to show you what have been previously marked as states 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, and 53. You could just look through those first and tell me whether or not you recognize all of those photographs.
I do recognize the photographs.
And just as in a general sense, what are they photographs of?
I would say most of them are overall photographs of the truck, and then there's a few specifically of the airbag and the driver's seat.
Okay. And are those all fair and accurate depictions of the Tacoma at the time that you processed it?
Yes, they are.
Your Honor, the state would move to admit states 47 through 53.
No objection, Judge.
Okay, 47 through 53 are objection.
Okay, so I'm going to go.
So why do you publish that? Why would that shame mark?
Oh, sure. All right, states 47. Can you explain to the jury what this photograph is of?
Certainly, this is an overall photograph of the truck from the driver's side rear corner.
Okay. And this is the Tacoma that you were processing?
Yes.
And states 48?
This is an overall photograph of the vehicle from the rear.
States 49?
This is an overall photograph of the vehicle from the front passenger corner.
And what information did you have about this Tacoma and why you were processing it?
My understanding and from gleaming from the search warrant as well and being involved in the investigation the day prior, this vehicle had been driven by a male identified as Mr. Bourgoin the wrong way on the interstate in Williston. It had crashed into a vehicle traveling southbound in which the 5 passengers of that vehicle were killed. So that our job at that point was to process this vehicle for evidence of who was driving it.
Okay. And did you in fact remove any evidence from the Tacoma with respect to that task?
Yes, I did. We removed the driver's side airbag that had been deployed in the crash.
Okay. And for what purpose?
As you can imagine, when an airbag is tucked within its compartment of a vehicle, there would be no reason for someone's DNA to be on the airbag. In this instance, because the airbag had deployed, We collect the airbag in hopes of obtaining a DNA sample to indicate who was driving the vehicle.
And who was driving the vehicle in the first crash? Is that
Correct.
correct? Okay. So I'll show you States 50. Can you tell the jury what that is?
Certainly, that's probably, I would say, a mid-range photograph from the open driver's door of the driver's compartment, specifically the steering wheel, with the airbag deployed.
Okay. And did the crime scene search team remove that airbag from where it is in this picture?
Yes, we cut it out of the compartment from the steering wheel.
Okay. So States 51.
This is an overall photograph of the airbag after it was cut out of the vehicle from the steering wheel, and it's on a sheet of what we call butcher paper.
Okay. And can you just tell the jury what the yellow marking is?
Certainly, the 3 is an indicator that we use telling us that that was the third piece of evidence that we'd identified and collected. So we put a marker with each piece of evidence, photograph it with and without the marker.
Okay. And States 52, first can you just tell us what that's a picture of?
Certainly. This is a photograph, again, from the door open of the driver's compartment, showing the driver's seat. The seatbelt was clipped into place to indicate that the seatbelt was worn during the impact by the driver. And the way that we can tell that is after a seatbelt is involved in a crash, it does not retract back in the way a normal seatbelt will. After it's pulled out and applied, you take it off and it retracts. During a crash, that mechanism does not work any longer and the seatbelt stays locked out.
Okay. So to clarify, the crime scene search team buckled it back in, correct? You didn't find it?
No, we did not find it that way. We buckled it back in place to show the seatbelt stretch to indicate that it was worn at the time of the crash.
Okay. And so I'll just show you States 53. Is that what you're showing in this picture?
Correct, showing that the seatbelt is stretched out, indicating somebody was sitting and belted in at the time of the crash.
Okay, thank you. And did you in fact send the steering wheel airbag to, or actually I'll say, when you collect evidence and you're looking, like you said, for DNA, what is your next step? What happens to that evidence?
The next step would be for us to package the evidence and for the evidence to be sent to the Vermont Forensic Lab for analysis.
Okay. And you in fact did that?
Yes.
Okay. And are you aware of whether or not DNA was found on the airbag?
I did learn further into the investigation that Mr. Bourgoin's DNA was in fact found on the steering wheel airbag.
Okay. And Judge, I have no further questions for Trooper Nolan. I do have a stipulation to enter before she's dismissed.
Okay.
No cross, Judge.
So there's no cross, but there is a stipulation?
There is.
Yeah.
Okay, so you want to read the stipulation?
So the stipulation for the jury is, members of the jury, the state and defendant, Stephen Bourgoin, have agreed that you may find certain facts. This is called a stipulation. The Toyota Tacoma involved in the 2 crashes on October 8th/October 9th was owned and registered by Joel Nijman. The Toyota Tacoma involved in the 2 crashes was only ever possessed by and driven by Stephen Bourgoin. As with any evidence in this trial, you must decide what weight you will give the stipulation.
Okay, is that stipulation marked?
It is, Your Honor. It's marked as State's Exhibit 86.
So 86 is admitted as a stipulation of fact. Just read that part.
Yes, Judge.
So no further questions. Thank you, Judge.
Thank you.
Thank you.
morning, Mr. Abraham.
Good morning.
Could you state your name and spell your last name, please?
Joseph Abraham, Abraham.
And what is your occupation?
I'm a forensic chemist,
And who are you currently employed by?
the Vermont Forensic Laboratory.
What's your specific title at the lab?
I'm primarily a DNA analyst,
Okay. And is that the same, what department are you employed in?
biology section.
Okay. What are your responsibilities in that job?
I receive evidence from criminal cases and isolate the DNA, and develop DNA profiles to compare to victims and suspects in crimes.
Okay. And can you describe your educational background?
I've got a Bachelor's of Science degree from the University of New Hampshire. The degree is in molecular, cellular, and developmental biology.
And did your formal education involve the study of DNA?
Yes.
Okay. Did it involve any hands-on work with DNA techniques?
Yes, it did.
And have you performed research in the area of DNA or DNA testing?
Yes.
Prior to your employment at the Vermont Forensic Lab, can you describe any other positions that you've held?
I worked for Boston Medical Center and Dartmouth College, and both those I did testing with DNA. Not human, but it was similar testing.
Okay. And as part of your employment at the Vermont Forensic Lab, are you required to stay up to date on the development in this area?
Yes.
And have you ever testified before today in the area of DNA testing?
Yes, I have.
You have any idea how many times?
I believe this is 22nd time.
Okay. And can you just tell the jury in the easiest way possible kind of what DNA is?
So DNA is the molecular blueprint for all organisms. It determines your biochemical and physical makeup.
Okay. And where is it found in humans?
In the nucleus of your cell.
And is all of our DNA the same?
No, with a few exceptions, everybody's pretty much different.
And what are those few exceptions?
If you were to get a bone marrow transplant, your blood type would be that of the donor, so your blood would have the DNA profile of the donor. Or if you're identical twin, the testing we do would not be able to differentiate between those.
Okay. And what is the PCR?
So PCR stands for polymerase chain reaction. This is a way for us to take very small samples of DNA and basically molecular photocopy of that so we can get more information out of that small sample. So the DNA is extracted, and the PCR process, we add some chemicals and an enzyme called polymerase, and that enzyme will copy between two specific portions of DNA we call primers, and it copies everything between those two primers. And we can repeat this process over and over so that we can copy those areas of DNA that we're looking for.
Okay. And is this method common in the United States?
Yes.
Are there controls used in the testing process?
Yes, so we use a series of commonly called a negative control. Those controls don't have any DNA in them, and what they do is they allow us to look throughout the process to make sure we didn't contaminate it with anything. We also have positive controls that allow us to know that our testing is working as we expect it to.
Okay. Do you also account for possible contamination?
Yes, and those controls that we use help us to determine if that occurs in the testing process.
Okay. And how do the controls play a role in whether or not any contamination has occurred?
So the negative controls will run side by side with our sample. So it gets all the same reagents that our sample, the same treatment our sample does, and that runs throughout the entire process. So at the end, if there's a profile popping up in the reagent blank, we know, okay, something happened. But we also know, because there's different negative controls that are incorporated in the testing, we can kind of isolate where it happened and go back and hopefully remedy the problem so that it doesn't happen again.
And so when you're testing DNA, what types of results can you get?
So you can get an inconclusive result, which would tell you that would be because maybe there wasn't enough DNA there, you couldn't get a full profile, or too much of a mixture that you wouldn't be able to determine who's who in the sample. You could get an exclusion, which you get a DNA profile from your evidentiary sample, but when you compare it to your suspect or victim, it doesn't match. Or you could get a match, and then in that case, your evidentiary sample profile matches that of the standard that's submitted, whether it be the victim or the suspect.
Okay. Can you give a little more explanation around what a mixture would be?
So a mixture happens when we get a sample in and you detect more than one person in the sample. And this can happen for many different reasons. Clothing, a lot of times, there's your DNA on it already, and then if like someone bleeds on top of that, you can get a mixture of the cells that were already there from you and then the blood from the other individual.
Do you and your lab undergo proficiency testing?
Yes, we do.
Okay, and how often are you proficiency tested?
DNA is required to do it twice a year.
Okay. And what are the results of your testing?
I've passed all my testing.
Okay. And what certifications or accreditations does the Vermont Forensic Lab have as it relates to DNA testing?
So currently the laboratory is accredited by ASCLAB Lab. It's the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors Lab Accreditation Board.
Okay. And does the Vermont Forensic Lab run testing for prosecution and defense parties?
Yes, we do.
Okay. And are quality assurances programs in effect for those testing?
Yes, yes they are.
So when Vermont Forensic Lab receives cases for DNA testing, what steps are taken to ensure that the evidence is, the integrity is kept for that evidence?
So when it's received at the laboratory, we have a designated evidence technician, and that individual's job is to make sure the evidence is, the outer packaging is secure and sealed. He will also have communications with the officer. Sometimes items need to be dried, so we have a process for drying those items. At that point, it's locked in a limited access facility. The whole laboratory is climate controlled. And then we have a lab management system. So the minute that item is submitted to the laboratory, it gets a designated item number and a barcode, and that gets a timestamp, and any movement throughout the laboratory is tracked. So if it goes to a different room, we know when it's transferred to that room. If it's submitted to one of the examiners, that examiner signs for it, and we have a tracking of who has it at every moment throughout the laboratory.
Okay. And is that also called a chain of custody?
Yes, it is.
Okay. What is a population frequency?
So population frequency is when we develop a DNA profile, each area on the profile, each possible allele, and this is, an allele is the size of the repeat of a particular chromosome, and all these alleles together give us a DNA profile. Well, each one of those possible locations is called an allele, and each one of those has a probability of existing. So each one of them is designated a certain value. And if you get a profile, you multiply up all those values, and you get a number that tells us how unique that profile is in the population.
Okay. And do you have specific education around that as well?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And in the course of your career, do you have any idea how many DNA tests that you have performed?
I've worked on about 2,000 cases, So there's probably about 35,000 samples.
Okay. Your Honor, at this time, the state would move to qualify Joseph Abraham as an expert in the area of DNA profiling.
Any objection? No. Okay, we'll find himself qualified.
So, Mr. Abraham, did you receive any evidence to analyze in this case?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And what evidence did you receive?
I received a few airbags from the suspect's pickup truck, as well as some swabs that were taken from the windshield.
Okay. And did you produce any formal reports that outlined the evidence you received as well as your results?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And before I get to your reports, I have two stipulations to enter into evidence. State's Exhibit 85, members of the jury, the state and defendant, Stephen Bourgoin, have agreed that you may find certain facts. This is called a stipulation. Detective Trooper Amy Nolan observed the removal of the steering wheel airbag from Mr. Bourgoin's Toyota Tacoma. The steering wheel airbag removed from his Tacoma is the same steering wheel airbag that Joseph Abraham tested and analyzed at the Vermont Forensic Lab. The steering wheel airbag was in the same condition from the time of removal from Mr. Bourgoin's Toyota Tacoma as when it was analyzed by Joseph Abraham. The chain of custody of this item is not being challenged. That states 85, Your Honor.
No objection. 85 is submitted as a stipulation of facts.
And states 87, the stipulation, a DNA sample was collected from Stephen Bourgoin on November 21st, 2016 by Trooper Brian Berry and sent to the Vermont Forensic Lab. This sample of DNA was analyzed by Joseph Abraham at the Vermont Forensic Lab and was in the same condition at the time of analysis as it was when it was collected from Stephen Bourgoin. Chain of custody of the DNA sample is not being challenged.
And no objection? No objection. Stipulation of facts in 87 is admitted.
And Mr. Abraham, I'm going to show you what has been marked as states 54 and states 55. Do you recognize those?
Yes, so States 54 is a copy of my DNA report for the testing of the evidentiary items, the airbags and the swabs from the windshield.
Okay.
And States 55 is a copy of the report that included the sample from Mr. Bourgoin, his buckle standard, and its comparison to the airbag.
Okay, and are these both true and accurate depictions of the reports that you wrote for this case?
Yes, they are.
Okay. The state would move to admit states 54 and 55.
No objection.
54 and 55 are admitted by agreement of the court.
And finally, I'm going to show you, actually, first, how did you receive the evidence that you described in this case?
So the evidentiary items, I went to my evidence technician and received them from her, and they were in sealed evidence bags, and I brought them to the exam room for processing.
Okay. And which item did you develop a DNA profile from any of the items?
Yes, I did.
Which item?
Item A4 was the container that had the steering wheel airbag, but I did some processing to swap the airbag later on. So the actual item I got a DNA profile from is A4-1-1.
Okay. And can you explain a little bit about how that's what's A4 and then -1-1?
So when we received the items in the exam room, sometimes certain items need to go off to different sections, so we have to break them down a little bit. So A4 is the outer container, which tells me, is usually the case number on it, a description of the item, so that we can track it back. And then I would open the bag. In this case, it's an airbag, so I open it up, I take pictures. A lot of times in situations like this, there would be blood stains on it. I didn't find any blood on any of the airbags, so when I take it out of the bag, then I give it a new number called the A4-1. And then any subsequent cuttings I might do or swabs I might do with that item, I would give it a sub-numbering of that. So the swab I took of the airbag, I called it A4-1-1.
Okay. And is that different from the number that Vermont State Police would have assigned it?
Yes, so there's a lot of times there's a difference in our numbering system, but in our descriptions, we would typically note that it was submitted under their number, whatever that number might be. When they submit items to the laboratory, they have a form that they send it in under. It's called a Laboratory Request Form 305. And that way they list it on there is the way we put it in our system. So sometimes they might have 8 items they've taken, but they only might send in 4. So there's a slight numbering difference.
Okay. And can you tell on your report what item number the Vermont State Police assigned the airbag?
Yes. So if I reviewed it, may I review my report?
Yes, it's in evidence. You can read it.
So item A4, I noted in my report is one sealed paper evidence bag marked item number 3, and then case number 16A1051171 steering wheel airbag, and VSP sticker marked item number 15, suspect truck driver's side airbag from driver's steering wheel.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to show you on the screen what's been previously admitted as State's Exhibit 51. Do you recognize that?
Yes.
So what is that?
That's the steering wheel airbag from the vehicle.
Okay, and is this the steering wheel airbag that you tested for DNA?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. And did you test it in accordance with all of your training and experience?
Yes.
And what were you able to conclude about the DNA profile that you obtained from this piece of evidence?
So upon extracting the DNA and developing a profile, there was a major DNA profile that was developed that was consistent with Mr. Bourgoin's standard.
Okay. What did you know at the time without having Mr. Bourgoin's sample? Did you just, what did
It
you
was
know
just
about it?
a major DNA profile, unknown individual at the time.
Okay. And so typically, once you develop that profile or you from the evidence, then do you look to compare it to something?
Yes.
Okay. And so was a standard sample for Mr. Bourgoin's DNA also given to you at some point?
Yes, a few months later, his standard was submitted for
Okay.
testing.
So how are you able to determine whether or not Mr. Bourgoin's sample was a match to the sample on this?
So what we do is when we develop a DNA profile, our instrument gives us, it's called an electropherogram. It's the genetic analyzer's results of the testing. We interpret those results and we put it in what we call an allele table. It makes it easier for us to do a comparison and look at the data.
Okay. So I'm going to show you, did you in fact do that for this case?
Yes.
So I'll show you what's been marked as states 56 and 57. Can you identify those?
Yes, these are, so State's Exhibit 57 is the allele table from the evidentiary sample, the swab from the airbag. And State's Exhibit 56 is the buckle standard submitted for Mr. Bourgoin.
Okay. And are those fair and accurate depictions of the results you received in this case?
Yes, there.
The state would move 56 and 57 into evidence.
No objection.
56 and 57 are admitted on agreement.
So I'm going to show you first the state's 57. Is this the allele table that you were just talking about?
Yes, it is.
There we go. Okay. And this is the allele table as it pertains to the airbag swab, is that correct?
That's correct.
And is that how you know?
Yes.
You identify each one on the top? And can you tell the jury then what all of these numbers are?
So if you look to the far left, at the top it says locus. Those are locations on the DNA chromosomes we test for. So, and if you look down, there's a listing of each one of them. And the column to just the right of that is the sample and what the profile that we developed from each of those locations is.
Okay. And you have a couple in parentheses, and most of them are not in parentheses, some are. Can you explain what the ones in parentheses represent?
So the ones in parentheses represent a minor profile that we're detecting on the sample. So we have a mixture of probably two people here, but clearly there's a major profile in the sample.
Okay. So are you able to make any conclusions about the sample in the parentheses?
Just that it's a minor contributor, not a full profile. We might be able to do an exclusion if we had a standard from somebody.
Okay. And who, in this case, could have deposited that onto the airbag?
Anybody who installed the airbag, or possibly one of the EMTs that responded to the scene, or anybody who collected the airbag at the time.
Okay. And other than potentially someone who installed it, if the jury has heard evidence that at least one witness got into the truck to see if anybody else was there, could that have been enough?
Yes, it's possible.
Okay. And is this type of limited DNA common to find on an airbag?
Yes, so in a situation where we swab the airbag, you run the chance of picking up anything that possibly touched it because we swab the entire surface. And we see this, I've had it happen on other airbag cases where I didn't have blood stains, because in a blood stain you're picking that exact spot. You're not running into the situation where you're sampling from the whole area. And we see it on clothing, very common too.
Okay. And so as to states 56, again, is this how you know that this one pertains to Mr. Bourgoin's sample?
Yes, it is.
Okay, and again, can you tell the jury what these numbers represent?
So again, on the left column, those are all the locations that we test for, and the right is Mr. Bourgoin's DNA profile.
Okay. And so then you take these two reports, and what do you do with them?
So we do a comparison of the profiles that we've been able to, the alleles that we've been able to identify that create the profile. And any place that they're different, then we have to scrutinize a little bit. So in those locations where there's things in parentheses, well, we've already determined there's a minor profile there from somebody we don't know, but the rest of the profile matches Mr. Bourgoin. So we considered that a match to the major profile of the airbag.
Is that what these are identifying?
Yes.
All the ways that they match?
Yes.
And did you do a statistical calculation of the major profile that you obtained on the airbag?
Yes, I did.
And is that included in your final report?
Yes, it is.
And what was the result of that calculation?
Well, if I read it directly from the report. So it's, as reported October 18, 2016, the probability of randomly selecting an unrelated individual exhibiting the major DNA profile at 22 loci, and that's all those areas that we look at. Obtained from item A4-1-1 is greater than 1 in 1 quadrillion from the combined population. So that's, we actually round it after it gets to 1 in 1 quadrillion. It's beyond that, it's hard to conceptualize the number.
Okay. And so in your opinion, what does that statistical number represent as a conclusion?
It says barring identical twin or, well, in this case there wasn't blood, so an identical twin Mr. Bourgoin could not be excluded as the contributor.
And is there a review process for your findings?
I'm sorry.
Was there a review process for
Yes.
these findings?
Yes, there is a review process.
And does your testing process require those reviews?
Yes, they do.
And were all of those review steps followed in this case?
Yes, they were.
Thank you. I have no other questions.
No questions, thank you.
Your Honor, if we could take the 15 minutes now. Our next witness is coming at 10:30.
So we'll take our morning recess at this point. Yeah, the admonition, we'll discuss this.
Swap.